Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Ensyde's webinar titled Refugee in the Environment. Our key speaker today, and I'm very excited to introduce Nayana Bose, who is a diplomat with the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, currently stationed in Rwanda. This is a series of various webinars that we are conducting to encourage exploration in different spaces and the interlinkages of the different areas that surround us with specifically the environment that we live in. This is one such journey, and I'm sure this is going to be an extremely exciting webinar, and I welcome all of you to listen in and ask questions. Thank you.
You cross an international border, so you are crossing an international border. But once the floods recede, you are then able to come back, whether it's to Bihar or to Bengal. So there is certainly a threat to your life and liberty because of the floods, and you have to leave to save your life. But you also have the option of coming back as soon as the situation improves. So that's why it's when we talk about refugees in the strict sense, we don't really use the term environmental refugee, not in the UNHCR, the UN definitions, and not when you're talking about IDPs. But it isn't just black and white. I mean, there are situations where a drought could lead to civil war, yeah, and then people might cross a border. So who are they then? Are they environmental refugees? Are they conflict refugees? So nothing is really as simple as it is. But for now, we'll just talk about refugees, IDPs, and people who have been forcibly who have been forced to leave. Next slide, Mana. Next slide, Manda. Okay, just to give just a quick snapshot of how many people are forcibly displaced. It's almost 79.5 million. That's a huge number. If it was a country, if all forcibly displaced people belong to a country, that would be the world's 20th biggest in terms of population.
Nayana, are you able to see the correct
and also
slide?
just to say, now out of this forcibly,
sorry, Nayana,
yeah, I
are you
can.
able to
Yeah,
see the correct
it's okay.
slide?
Yes, this is the right slide.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Mandal. So out of let's just say 80 million for the sake of being simple, 80 million people are forcibly displaced today. That's a huge number. Out of that number, 45.7 are internally displaced, which means they are displaced within their countries. 29.6, almost 30 million are refugees, meaning that they are outside of their countries and are displaced because there's a threat to their life and liberty. Asylum seekers are those who are seeking asylum, i.e. when you cross an international border, your first step is to seek asylum. You will see that there are many children who are displaced. The 5 countries, it's not really a surprise. It's Syria, Venezuela might be a bit of a surprise to see that. The countries that produce the most number of refugees, it's Syria, Venezuela, Afghanistan, South Sudan, and Myanmar. Next slide, please, Manuel. Hi, can we go on to the next slide? Yeah, okay. So this is a visual of Cox's Bazar, Bangladesh. If you look at that slide, you will see how congested it is. It is one of the most congested areas, and you have nearly 1 million refugees. The exact number is 900,000 plus, so it's almost a million, but not exactly. All these people are squeezed in an area which is about 26 square kilometers. It's extremely congested. They're very basic facilities. They live in bamboo huts. The roofing is just plastic sheets. It's a difficult terrain in the sense that it's not flat. If you look at the picture, it's up and down. They're not high hills or mountains, but they are hills. And when it rains, and this is a part of Bangladesh which is very, very prone to cyclones, to very, very heavy monsoons, it's actually quite a really difficult time for everyone because you have the camps get flooded, you have to move people who are on the sides of the hills. Because of the deforestation that happened, it's more vulnerable. The soil is more vulnerable to these heavy rains and monsoons. It's also a cyclone area. Luckily, the year that I was there, that was 2018, 2019, the two cyclones actually hit Orissa and Andhra. They developed in the Bay of Bengal, but luckily the landfall, sorry, wasn't in Cox's Bazar because it would have been absolutely terrible. So people always ask, certainly this is a verdant part of Bangladesh. There were thick forests, and now you can't see. You can just see a little bit of greenery, not even the trees, and everything's gone. And people always say, what has happened to the environment there? But when you think of it, in the first 6 weeks of well, I won't use the word genocide, in the first 6 weeks of the problems that started in August 2017, you had more than 500,000 people who came into Bangladesh. That is a huge number for any country to deal with. So in 6 weeks, you had 500,000 plus, 500,000 people fleeing the borders, coming into Bangladesh, and basically setting up their homes, whatever they could, wherever they could. So at that point, yes, a lot of deforestation did happen. The environment was impacted, but then you also have to think of it in terms of human life or environment. So it wasn't an ideal situation, but in an influx of that size and that scale, also the speed of the influx, it's 500,000 people in 6 weeks. That's a huge, huge number. There wasn't much that one could do. Next slide, please, Manuel. Next slide, please. Okay, just to give you an idea of how fast things used to be built up in Bangladesh, you'll see the previous slide, Mana. You'll see on your left-hand side, it's barren land, which was given by the government to decongest the camps. The previous slide, Mandar. Previous, these are ahead. Yeah, okay, on your left-hand side, you will see this was in March. The government had given a few extra acres of land. They said you can make this into a place. Yeah, the government had said you can make this into a place where you can set up your camps. In 3 months, you can see the slide on the right-hand side. It is the same slide, the same picture.
Sorry, is this the correct
Anyway,
slide?
so on the right, so it's basically the time span. That,
I'm sorry, there's a time lag.
yeah, this is the correct slide. Yeah, just keep it on this.
Perfect. Okay.
Okay, this is the right slide. So what I was trying to say was when you can plan for housing and for shelter and things, when we were given extra land because the camps were terribly congested and many people were extremely vulnerable, it took us just 3 months to clear the land because this land that the government had given was extremely rocky. We had to clear the rocks, we had to flatten it. There were just these hills. But in 3 months' time, we were able to set up fairly decent shelters in Cox's Bazar. Next slide, please, Mandar. Hi.
Sorry, Nayana, are you able to see the slide now?
Okay, if the slides are difficult, I'm not, but that's okay. Yeah, this is fine. Thank you. Thank you. Right. So this is just to give some examples of what people do and how do you survive in a terrain that's difficult. Yes. So the bamboo bridge you see on the first picture, these are built by refugees. These are eco-friendly solutions because, as I mentioned earlier, there are lots of hills up and down. So to be able to connect from one to the other, the bamboo bridges were built by Rohingya refugees. In the other side, on the next picture, you can see how you sort of prepare for the monsoons and for the rains. And these are just sandbags put next to houses to stabilize the slope. So when it rains really hard, it is hoped that the soil underneath the bags will remain where it is and the whole thing doesn't get washed away. These are really, they're not like high-tech solutions, but when you are in a situation where you have limited funding, it is a difficult place. The monsoons are well known in that part of Bangladesh. These are things that you can do to mitigate some of the detrimental effects of the environment. Okay, next slide, please, Mana. Right. So now, in addition to all the natural things, you think about slopes, you think about monsoons, you think about cyclones. There's also a unique situation in Cox's Bazar, and this is the problem of wild elephants, because okay, so I think we're on the right slide now. I was talking about Rwanda. Um, I also wanted to say that environment and clean energy is a key priority for the government of Rwanda here. Camps are well planned, but they have their challenges of ravines because this is genuinely a country of 1,000 hills. So it's not like Cox's Bazar, where you have sand castles, we used to call them, small hills rolling up and down. Here you actually have proper hills and mountains. So all the camps actually, without exception, are up on a hill or a hilltop or on their slopes. So with it comes the challenge of ravines, heavy rains in Rwanda as well, very, very heavy rains. They have a short rainy season and a long rainy season. So rains and general environmental rehabilitation is really important. The government, again here, it's a small country, but they're very clear that one of their priorities is that clean energy and environmental rehabilitation. So at the recent Global Refugee Forum, now this was in December in Geneva, if I can just go back a bit, in 2016 in New York, there was a huge, let's just say a huge UN conference where all the countries participated. And the end of that summit was something called the New York Declaration. The entire conference was about how to help refugees, and equally importantly, how to help countries that are hosting refugees. Because most countries that host refugees are not economically very advanced. Most refugees live in developing countries. So from the New York Declaration came a set of things. One was the Global Compact on Refugees, and this really has become a blueprint for every country now. The Global Compact for Refugees has the same sort of vision and the same objectives that the New York Declaration had. It's how to help refugees living in countries, how to include them in national systems, and also how to help countries that are hosting these refugees. Under the Global Compact on Refugees, GCR, came a comprehensive refugee response framework. By the way, that is my official title here. I am the Comprehensive Refugee Response Officer. It sounds very grand, but it comes under this whole framework of a Global Compact of Refugees. And under this Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework, one of the many activities that come under that was to host something called the Global Refugee Forum. So I'm sorry to go into all this kind of jargon, but it sort of puts in place where these pledges and commitments were made. Next slide, Mana. The next slide, you'll see the commitments made in particular for energy and environment for Rwanda. These are exactly as they've been recorded. Firewood is banned, and even using of charcoal is actually banned. But you see that because obviously there are still challenges. You can see these people are selling charcoal in the camps. But what we're trying more and more is that we supply gas, so clean energy. We also supply briquettes for that's a kind of biomass fuel for cooking, so that people don't have to use coal. But this remains a very high priority area for Rwanda. Environment, clean energy, how do you coexist the refugee population with the environmental concerns? Next slide, please. This I just wanted to end with this slide actually. So it was a statement made on World Environmental Day, that was on the 5th of June, from our UNHCR headquarters. In a nutshell, it just talks about the first thing I had mentioned, that when, you know, because of environmental reasons, if that leads to a drought leads to a civil war. People are forced to cross borders. What happens? Who is responsible? Are they conflict refugees? Are they environmental refugees? We know that legally there is no such term as environmental refugee. So these are some of the things we're grappling with. But the statement also very clearly talks about how UNHCR has been working for several decades to reduce the environmental impact of the presence of refugee camps and settlements. refugee camps and settlements, unfortunately, are a reality in the world we live in. There is more and more internal conflict in countries, so you find less of people having to cross international borders, but still, this is not something that's going to go away. And some of the examples they've mentioned are the waste treatment plant for refugees. This is for solid waste management, actually, in Cox's Bazar, renewable energy solutions in Rwanda, which I've mentioned and shown you the pledges, in Tanzania and Ethiopia, and land restoration projects in Cameroon. So these are just some of the examples I've given. The reason I have the statement up there is to say that we are well aware of the impact that refugees can have, refugees, internally displaced people, those who are forcibly displaced, can have on the environment. But at times there really is, you really can't choose. So you have to somehow coexist with both. And for us as a humanitarian organization first, we put people first, but the environment is more and more important to sustain these people. Not only refugees, but also the host communities and the countries that are hosting them. Thank you.
Thank you, Nayana. I think, I mean, given with all the technical issues that we had, you still managed to cover some of the most important aspects related to two large crisis kind of, issues that we face today in the world. One clearly focusing on, humans and, the impacts that we create to the environment. And the second is really about just the fact that the dependencies of people on the environment to kind of basically manage their livelihoods, right? So I think both of these are extremely critical, and there are no clear boundaries, right? And that's something that your presentation clearly showed. I'm going to open it up for questions, and I hope there will be. I'm sure there'll be many. If there's anyone who wants to unmute themselves, or if you want, you can ask the question on the chat box, and we can. Nayana will be happy to take that. Okay, so there is a question here. Let me just a minute. Yeah, so I think there's a question from Anu asking about the thoughts on banning coal in refugee camps in the name of environmental friendly initiatives, when some of the most polluting nations in the world are still struggling to curb their own environmental impact.
In refugee camps?
Sorry, Nayana?
The question was about banning coal when some, sorry, let me just see what's in the chat box.
So basically your thoughts on banning coal in refugee camps.
Yeah, well, this is particular to Rwanda, and as I said, this is a country that's prioritized environmental, basically the environment and the impact on it. It's also prioritized clean energy, clean fuel. So this is something specific to Rwanda, and whether it's possible or not, because people will still buy coal because it's cheaper. It's officially banned, but as that picture clearly showed, there are people buying. Coal and other things. It's also, I mean, in terms of air pollution, it is better not to use coal. Yeah, especially when people live close to each other in congested areas. There are a lot of health reasons as well, in addition to environmental reasons, why you should not be using charcoal. This isn't the case in Cox's Bazar. There are efforts to provide clean energy, but given the vast numbers there, it's 900 million people, even with the best of intentions, coal is still quite widely used over there. Firewood has become less now because we are giving briquettes and different kinds of biomass, but coal remains a cheap alternative in many refugee camps, even today.
Yeah, thanks, Nayana. There's one more question from Ankit, which I think is kind of talks about all the issues that you have actually covered. It's a larger question in terms of what countries and policies are, what kind of interventions there are to reduce the stress on environment, especially in the cases of, which I think you have covered to some extent, but maybe you want to touch upon it a little bit more. In specific countries, what kind of policy interventions are there that you're aware of?
Yeah, okay. I can speak about Rwanda because that's where I am now, and so I can talk a bit more about the pledges that the government has made. For any of you traveling to Rwanda, by the way, plastic is banned. So if you should travel to come to visit me, you can't carry your duty-free bags if they're plastic bags. They will stop you at the airport. So there are different things. It's not just only targeted to refugees. It's the entire population as a whole. Even for the local population, you're not supposed to be cooking with charcoal. So in and outside of refugee camps, the policies are quite the same. The commitments they've made, I mean, the one about building resilient refugee settlements and rehabilitating ravines, it needs a lot of money, and there's a fair bit of funding that comes in. There is something at the moment from the World Bank called the IDA 18 sub-window funding. Some of it will be focused on environmental rehabilitation in the camps. The clean energy, there are private sector people who are involved in Rwanda who are providing gas, safe gas to many of the refugee camps. It isn't 100% coverage yet. It's 60% of all refugee households in Rwanda now have access to gas for cooking. But it depends from country to country. So in Rwanda, it is a country that goes beyond just refugee camps and others. They've banned plastic. Even neighboring Kenya, you can't carry plastic into the country. So in some ways, some of the African countries are quite ahead of many other countries when it comes to environmental policies.
Thanks, Aina. There's one more question from Anulav asking what needs to be done at an individual level or government level to take care of this climate-induced refugee issue?
The climate-induced refugee. Well, at the individual level, there's, I mean, it's you're basically talking about climate change and what causes people to cross borders. So I'm not, as I said earlier, I'm not a technical expert on this. I think, Mana, you can chip in here. What can be done so that generally we are better, we live better with the environment we're given, that we don't, the climate change that everyone talks about, what can we do to, at an individual level, to reduce that? I think you'd be better placed to answer that one, if you want to.
Well, I'd be happy to, but I think I'll probably need a whole 40 minutes webinar for that. Yes. So I will save it for a one-on-one with Anula at some point. But I think what would be useful to kind of look at, Naina, I think for me as a question is that given, I mean, I guess in refugee camps and in large establishments which have been built up to cater for the refugees, have there been rehabilitation of the environment as well? I mean, post, say, if there's a camp that has shifted, are you still there? Yeah, okay.
Sorry,
did you, I think you froze for a bit.
Sorry, Manuel, I missed some of your audio. I heard up to refugee camps, but could you just repeat the question?
I will just repeat that. So basically, I was saying that just like you have, when you have large established campsites, when there is a movement out of those campsites, if hopefully there is a movement out of that for the refugees looking at better livelihood opportunities elsewhere, is there a system where you have the environmental improvements taking place in those sites because now people have moved out of that area? Do you see that happening at all? So like the deforestation plans for the campsite. So do they go back and look at afforestation of that, for example?
Yeah, so if and when refugee camps cease to exist, then we can talk about the step, because at the moment, the largest refugee camps, which is in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, refugees are allowed to stay only in the camps. They're not allowed to leave. They can go, outside the camp for, in next village or so on to work, but they come back and live in the camp. So that is actually where they're designated to stay. And I don't see that changing very quickly. I mean, they will not be restriction. Movement is quite restricted, so they actually stay in the camps and have been in the camps for many, many, many years. In Rwanda, again, most of the 92% of refugees in Rwanda stay in camps. There are 6 camps that host them. Livelihood opportunities here, since the camps are close to, some of them are close to tea plantations, for example. So some of the refugees, we're looking at that as an expanded commitment made in livelihoods. So for tea plantations, which are privately owned, to expand so that they can employ refugees who can work and come back. But even here, I don't see, maybe in the future, in an ideal world, refugees will be able to come out of the camps. Maybe some go back home, maybe some get resettled, maybe some locally integrate. But as of now, at least in the 2 countries I've worked in Rwanda and in Cox's Bazar, that doesn't seem very likely. On the other hand, in Turkey, many of the camps have closed down because a large number of the Syrian refugees there are urban refugees. So they live in urban areas, mainly Istanbul, Ankara, along the coast. So in Turkey, it's quite different, and some of the camps have actually closed down. I can't remember how many. But there again, these were in Turkey, the camps were very temporary structures. They were tented camps. So I would assume, and there was nothing, there was no deforestation or anything cut for that because it's flat land. It's a bit like Afghanistan. There was enough land to host the camps when they were set up.
Right, right. I think that kind of addresses, I mean, a problem that we are literally through creating more and more, areas for people to live in, which is unplanned, obviously, because refugee issues are unplanned, and thereafter we are more governments are probably playing a reactive role to addressing one crisis issue with in as much tandem with the environmental issue, because we are looking at resource provisions for those people who are there, and thereby creating new cities and new towns in a sense, because they don't ever leave by and large, like you mentioned, at least in some specific countries. So there is a problem, which is so much larger than we can ever understand, I think, in a sense, because governments having to deal with one large refugee problem, but also having to deal with an environmental resource allocation problem. So yeah, it's very interconnected, and that's why I found this topic extremely interesting. And Naina, you coined the title for this, which is Refuge in the Environment, because and that's exactly what this is, right? In a sense, you've covered a lot of those very nicely. We do have the same question again by Professor Nagendra, asking about, and maybe if you have thoughts that you can put into place for this, Naina, let us know. Views on your refugee-induced climate problems. I mean, I think that continues to be a point that a few of the others are also asking. I feel I'll let you go take a stab at it, and then maybe I can add in as well.
Okay. What I had earlier shared in the beginning of the presentation were the legal definitions. So under that, the environment is not considered a persecuting factor. And the example I'd given was about, if you have floods and people cross an international border, the fact that you come back to your homes and the environment is not continuing to persecute you doesn't meet, which
We're all here. I think we'll probably have to wind up in 5 minutes. So go ahead and complete your thought. Yeah.
Not sure where you lost me, but I was talking about an island somewhere off the coast of New Zealand, Australia, called Vanu or Vani. Anyway, there's rising sea levels there, and there obviously there is no drought or there's no conflict, but because of the rising sea levels, its inhabitants have been forced to seek refuge in Australia. Many have gone to Australia seeking asylum. Some have been accepted, but under under a special category as an exception, So legally still there's no term for environmental refugee, but that's as clear a case that can be made because there is no other persecuting factor when you have rising sea levels and you have to leave, otherwise your entire country would drown. But otherwise, this remains a gray area. When it's linked to conflict, it then becomes easier for international organizations like UNHCR and governments as well to accept these people as refugees. So if you think of an area where there's drought first, and then there is conflict over scarce resources, conflict could be ethnically determined, it could be any other reason, then people are forced to leave. You can still accept these people and justify them, legally accept them as refugees, saying they fled because of conflict and because of their particular ethnicity, they were targeted and so on. But if there's no right or wrong answer in that, if you check on the internet, on Google, there are plenty of very well established and well respected academics who write about environmental refugees. So it may not be a legal definition given by the United Nations and under the 51 Convention, but there is a lot of work, a lot of writing that's been done by very reputed people talking about environmental refugees. I
Yeah,
think I'll
I
stop
think
there.
that's no, that I think that's an excellent example. Talking about the sea level rise and some areas which need to then have to move because they don't have a choice. I think that's a connection that you kind of brought in very well, I think. Naina, there's one more question on probably something more up your alley in terms of what you've experienced on the ground, because Ankit asks, what is the challenges faced in integrating refugees to a new culture and a new country? I'm sure that's a huge question, but I'm sure you'll be
Mm.
the most, able to do justice to that.
Okay. Okay. Well, okay. My overseas postings. Okay. So, for example, the refugees in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, they basically they've come from across the border. They're Rohingya. The religion is the same. Physically, they look very much like Bangladeshis. The dialect that they speak is very similar to Chittagonian, which is a dialect people from Chittagong in Bangladesh speak. So in that particular case, there's not much. They're very alike. It's the same for the Congolese and Burundian refugees, more for the Congolese and the Burundian refugees who are in Rwanda, because again, it's across borders. Many of these borders are man-made, culturally very, very similar. Religion is similar. There's not much of a problem here. Syrian refugees in Turkey, I think this question is better like if I place them for people who've made it, say Syrian refugees in Europe, or even the refugees we have in India who come from Afghanistan, who come from Myanmar. It's not necessarily the Rohingyas, even other lost you. Okay, many of these refugees get resettled somewhere in the West. We have a resettlement program. It's one of the solutions to end a refugee cycle. So if you think of, say, Syrian refugees being resettled in Sweden or Afghan refugees being resettled in New Zealand, this is one of the solutions we have at our disposal. There, this whole question about culture and everything comes in because everything is different. Language is different, religion is different, the entire environment is different. And most resettlement countries have an orientation program. They will have people coming and explaining what are the cultural norms, how people live there, language classes and so on to help people to integrate. But otherwise, in most live refugee situations like the ones in Bangladesh, the people are very similar. The Rohingya are extremely similar to the Bangladeshis in religion, in their physical appearance, even the language. The language the Rohingya speak is very similar to Chittagonian, which is what people in Chittagong in Bangladesh speak. Similarly, in Rwanda, people crossing from Congo, it's very difficult to differentiate as well. Language, religion, all that is same. So there's not a huge cultural problem there. And in most situations, refugees, their first place of asylum is a neighboring country. So again, it's not so much there. It's when you talk about resettlement, when people go, or when people go to a completely different place like Europe, where everything is different. For Syrian refugees, Afghan refugees, religion, language, everything is different then.
Thanks, Naina. I think we've got about 5 minutes, so I just wanted to, ask you I mean, you've had close to 30 years, out there in the field, 10, of course, in Delhi, but that's also out in the field as far as I'm concerned.
Not 30 years. It's not even. Yeah, it's not. it's about not even 20 yet, but yeah, getting there.
Okay,
20
20
years
years.
old.
And I think that's far
Not yet.
far more
Yeah.
than any of us probably have in terms of being out in the field and seeing the kind of variety of issues that you probably witness, from children to the environmental aspects to the health issues to such a range of kind of things that impact a refugee in any part of this the world, right? I guess the question I have for you is what is that one thing, if you had to pick one experience that you will probably never forget, uh, what would that be?
Oh my God, Manuel, that's a really tough question, yeah, because there are just so many stories and so many people that I've interacted with in this time, and it's not necessarily only abroad. I mean, I have very fond memories of Afghan refugees in Delhi. There was this Syrian girl in Turkey. So for me to pick out one would be difficult. I can quickly go through at least maybe the Syrian girl in Turkey. I'd gone to do a story on something else. The Japanese government were giving some food vouchers, and I'd gone to visit vulnerable families who'd come in from Syria to ask how these vouchers were working, were they able to access the markets, etc. But while I was talking to the lady of the house, there were about 3 or 4 children there, and there was one girl who was just leaning against the door of the room. And I looked down and I saw that she was standing on one leg. She just had nothing. So if you think of a pair of jeans and you see a foot like a normal leg in one part of it and the other just the jeans. So after I finished, the reason I'd gone there was about this voucher story. Then I asked if I could speak to the girl and if I could speak to them. And her story is something I will never forget. I mean, she lost her leg in a bombing in Syria. They were playing outside, she and her brother, and there was aerial bombing. She fell on top of her brother to save him. The bomb fell, something fell on her. I think it was the top of the roof, a stone slab fell, sliced her leg off. It took them 3 weeks to be able to cross the border into Turkey because they were then first internally displaced in Syria. She was only 14 when this happened to her. And then when they came to Turkey and finally got decent medical care, it was too late. So gangrene had set in, and her leg had to be amputated. And now I met her like when she was 17, and it was just the little things. I mean, I asked how she dealt with it, and she said, well, initially I used to ask God, why did this happen to me? Why did my leg have to go, and why did this happen to me? But I then was with a colleague of mine from the local office. I think it was Hatay. I can't remember which part of Turkey. And I asked if there was something that we could do. So to cut a long story short, by the time I left Turkey, we had, through other NGO and other help, managed to find a Jaipur leg for her, like so that she could go back to school. My last picture of her is, she's standing in her school uniform, going to a Turkish school. Of course, she has a false leg, but because her own leg was amputated.
That's quite amazing. Sorry, Naina, we have less than a minute to go, so I wanted to thank you for being, just being there and talking about these stories to all of us, because I think we are so far removed from those kind of problems that you have encountered. And just to kind of wrap up in terms of the interlinkages between everything that we see and the environment, I mean, is something that I hope these kind of webinars will open, the thought process to everybody else out there, just to kind of see the linkages between everything that we do and kind of see where is it that there is a possible intervention that we can provide in our own spaces, in our own lives, in different ways. So I want to thank all of you. We are running out of time. So thank you, Naina. Thanks for an amazing presentation. And I do again apologize for all the technical issues that there was. But in spite of which, I think we did, it was a fantastic presentation. So thank you so much.
Thank you for organizing it, Manda.